This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
All right, so making our writing accessible to our audiences. So this is one of 4 forward torpedo tubes on a Los Angeles class fast attack submarine. Pretty cool, huh? If you look to the left, in the left-hand corner of the picture, you'll see a second tube, and it actually has a torpedo sitting there in it. So this torpedo tube is 21 inches wide, 21 inches in diameter, and it runs for 25 feet. That's about 10 paces. You could probably put a little more than half of a telephone pole inside this tube. And it goes basically from the breech all the way down to the outer hull of the boat. And about once a month, a sailor has to crawl down that space to do preventive maintenance and inspections to make sure everything's working. So torque the bolts, make sure all the moving parts are working. That's really a neat job. I'm sure they're all excited about doing that because the average American shoulders are 16 inches apart. Remember, that's 21 inches. So this is sort of what it looks like when somebody is trying to crawl down this tube. What they tell me is that you have to put your one arm forward and your other arm back behind you and then kind of scrunch your shoulders and then scoot your way down the tube. And the other kicker is you have to go down head first. You can't go down feet first because there are things at the end of the tube that you have to work on. So this is kind of a metaphor for our writing. So we have this tube that's really hard to get into and get out of and to access and do your job, right? And so that started me thinking, well, how is it that we can write so that our dear readers spend time thinking about our concepts rather than struggling with our words? And I'll do this in kind of 2 phases here. I'll talk first of all about how we can structure our papers for accessibility. And then I'll talk about the content itself and how we actually do writing to allow our readers accessibility to our writing and make it easier for them. Again, so they're not struggling with what the heck we're trying to say, but they're actually thinking about the content. So what content would you expect to find in these 2 genres of writing, graphic novels versus a research paper? Jay, what would you expect to see when you open up Toy Story for the comic book? What's going to be inside? Not the story itself, but what does it look like? What's the content? What's the feeling?
Sure, simplicity, pictures with simple sentences.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's hand drawings, right?
Yep.
Probably going to be fantasy, maybe humorous, but some of them get quite dark. Of course, Batman versus Superman and all that kind of stuff. So Nora, what would you expect to find when you open up a research paper? What's the difference? Compare and contrast that to our graphic novel.
A research paper is more structured. There are subheadings. It's more guided, I suppose.
Okay, but what about the tone and the words themselves?
Oh, boring.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish academic writing could be a lot, I don't know, maybe humor. There should be, but that's not all yet.
So it's going to be pretty academic. It's probably going to have a unique vocabulary to that specific content, if it's biology or mathematics or whatever. Yeah, great. So there's this principle in cognitive science called associative networking. Our brain is structured so that we associate words with feelings, with visual images, and like a puppy. What do you think when you see a puppy? You think cuddly, furry, fun. It makes you feel good. And when we see these genres of writing, it activates this network. We know kind of what's going to be involved in these different genres of writing. So imagine for a second what would happen if you wrote a research paper and did what Nora suggested. You actually put it in the form of a graphic novel. What do you think would happen? Nothing. you would never get published, right? Because you're writing way outside the expectation of the reader. So when you signal with a structure and then you have a different content, you're creating this cognitive dissonance, and the reader gets confused and is no longer thinking about what's in your writing. They're just thinking, why the heck did you do it that way? Okay. I actually tried to talk a doctoral candidate into writing her research in a graphic novel format, and she didn't buy it. But I guess the lessons learned there is that if you ever come to me to work with me as a consultant, you better bring your A game, because there's no telling what we're going to wind up doing in that 45 minutes. Okay, so if you were to pick one of these papers over the other one, which would you prefer to read and why, Valentin?
Two, because it's just, looks a little more manageable.
Okay, more manageable.
Even though it looks a little bit longer, it just the shorter spaced out paragraphs look more appealing.
Okay, Jennifer, what do you think?
Two, because there's space between the paragraphs. It just looks less like a big block of gray, and it just is more appealing to the eye. Seems like it would be easier to be able to take in the concepts and the content.
Yeah, cool. Does anybody think one would be easier to read? There's no right answer, wrong answer. I'm just curious. Anybody would rather read number one than number two? Yeah, so I think you're all exactly right. And oh, by the way, these are exactly the same number of words and the same sentences. Nothing's changed, except what I did was I went in and I managed the white spaces, right? So when you structure your paper, white spaces are really important. I subtly changed the points between the lines. I bumped it up to 3. You probably didn't even notice that. You noticed the spaces between the paragraphs, but you didn't really notice that 3 point. But that makes a huge difference to the reader. It just makes it easier on the eyes. It makes it easier for the reader to get through. Incidentally, and you should write this down, your paragraph should be 7 to 8 sentences long. That's kind of the rule of thumb. The paragraph police won't come and arrest you if you got 9 sentences, but if you start getting longer than that, then it starts getting kind of chunky and clunky. So try to keep your paragraphs to about 7 or 8 sentences. And Valentin hit the nail on the head. What you're signaling here in this structure is some sort of organization. This isn't a random hodgepodge of thoughts thrown together. This is organized and laid out specifically for a reason. And that really appeals to us mentally. We just look at that and we go, okay, it's not chaos, there's organization. I can figure this out and go from there. Okay, so this structure signals some sort of organization. Vera, what do you expect to read in the first paragraph there? What's that going to be about?
That's going to be my thesis statement of the entire writing right there, what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, very good. So what do you expect to see in paragraph 5?
Concluding remarks, summary.
Yeah, exactly. And so paragraphs 2 and 3 and 4 are going to be something that supports the main point or the thesis, right? It's going to be the argument that supports the theory that you laid out in your thesis in the first paragraph, and the conclusion, of course, is going to kind of synthesize all the main points there. So good. Gosh, you're a really sharp group. I love this. We're cooking right along. All right, so let's do this. Which would you prefer to read? The one on the left or the one on the right? Rachel.
The one on the left.
Left, okay.
And
why?
because
what is it about?
the headers really help. Like, I don't know, I think like most people, when you are reading, you're kind of skimming for keywords, and so it's helpful to have those headers.
Oh, perfect. Gosh, you are really a sharp group. We're all master students. We don't have enough time in the day to read everything we're supposed to read and write everything we're supposed to write. So pretty quickly in our programs, we learn to fillet the information, right? And to get through it very quickly. So what do? We read the intro, We kind of skim through the middle part there. We look for key words or key phrases. And when the author bolds those for us, you know, if I'm really interested in anion osmund elementum, I can stop and read that paragraph. But more than likely, I'm just going to grab that main point, grab everything else, get down to the conclusion, and get the heck on with my life, right? And the one on the right is good. We decided that earlier because it presents itself well. But just having those bold highlights just really helps the reader. It signals the organization and helps us move through the paper quickly. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about proportionality. So what I did was I divided up the writing and I just made it look good to my eye, right? I didn't count lines or anything. I didn't count 7 or 8 lines in a paragraph. I just kind of laid it out. And lo and behold, I had about 10% in the introduction, 10% in the conclusion, and 80% in my main points. And I think that's the proportionality of your paper has to make sense to your reader. You should spend more time on the main parts of your paper and less time on the lesser things. So which one of these is not like the other one? I had a student that came in and we were going through her paper and she got down to this 4th paragraph and she said, Lynn, we need to work on this paragraph because I just don't like it. I mean, it was before we looked at it. She said, I just don't like this paragraph. So what's going on in this paragraph? Why does it stick out from the other ones? Why is it not like the other ones? And without reading it, I just sort of thought of a couple of things. First of all, I thought, well, maybe she's too wordy, right? Maybe this just needs to be pared down. We just need to cut words out. Maybe it doesn't, it just lacks coherence and cohesion, right? It's not flowing together very well. It's kind of clunky. It's just a bunch of stuff thrown in without little transition or connectors or things like that. Maybe it just has more information. Those are all legitimate reasons. But the question is, if this paragraph has more information, if you're taking more time to explain this paragraph than the other two, why are you doing that? And maybe this main paragraph ought to be your entire paper. Maybe you should divide this main paragraph down and make that your argument and change your thesis. So just looking at the proportionality of your paper can tell you a lot about what's going on in it. And it can make you think about, is this the right structure? Am I communicating well with my reader? Or is the reader going to look at this longer paragraph and go, what's going on here? And then your reader's not thinking about concepts and you're kind of losing your audience. Okay, so we have several members in the audience that are over at the LBJ School. They're executive masters in public leadership. They're halfway through their course now, and they're about to start writing their capstone, which is the equivalent of a thesis. For some reason, they just call it a capstone. And here's the capstone guidance. No more than 30 pages. The professors make it perfectly clear that if you write 31 pages, they ain't reading it past page 30. And you have to put 5 things in your capstone. You have to define an important problem. You have to do some research and analyze that problem. And you have to use that as your reason why you're attacking an important problem. You have to have a feasible action plan that you can implement. And then you have to have measures of effectiveness to measure whether your plan is working or not as you're implementing it. And then you have to discuss budget implications. Okay, fairly simple, right? You go to school for 15 months, you just write down everything that you learned in 15 months, you're done. Well, not so fast. So I started writing my paper. In my first draft, the first 2 topics, define the problem and give the analysis, was 22 pages long. Now it's double spaced, but still I'm using up 2/3 of my paper just introducing the topic, right? So obviously this wasn't going to work. So I said, okay, maybe I need to kind of assign myself some page counts so I can get the proportionality of this paper. And what I figured was the topic and the support, that ought to be about 5 pages out of 30. The majority of my paper ought to be about my action plan, because that's where I'm demonstrating to the faculty that I learned the core competencies. But more importantly, that's the meat of this project is, what am I going to go and do in order to execute change within my organization? And then I just kind of wagged it. 3 pages on measures of effectiveness, 3 pages on budget implications. At this point, it really doesn't matter what the proportionality is, but having some kind of a goal to shoot for really helped me out. Now I'm writing way too long, right? 22 pages for the first 2. So I took a lot of data, a lot of the methodology and a lot of the raw data, and I just dumped it into appendices, right? Because the professors didn't say anything about an appendix, and they didn't give me a word count for that. So I just took all that data and I put it in an appendix. And then I went through and I went through a concision drill, got my words down as tight as I could. And then finally, I did what Arthur Quiller Couch talks about. I just murdered some of my darlings, right? As a master's student, we are full of knowledge and we work our butts off and we read research papers and we take notes and we just have all this information. And there's this proclivity to put all that information into a paper. I mean, it's just natural. I want to get credit for all this work I did. But sometimes you just have to skewer it, right? You just have to throw it out. You just have to go to a higher level, assume more intelligence on the part of your reader, and then move on with your work, because you just don't have enough space to cram all of that in. Any questions on that? Does that kind of make sense? Anybody have any questions? Okay, good, thanks. All right, one more time. And this one's kind of tricky. So which of these 2 would you prefer to read? The one on the left or the one on the right? Campbell.
I still say the one on the left.
Ooh, okay, why?
I don't know. I like the font better for some reason.
Oh, okay, very good. So this, by the way, same word count. It is a different font, but it's the same pitch, right? So the one on the right just happens to, this is a trick for students. If you use the font on the right, and I'll tell you what it is in a second, and you're running short on your paper, just use something that gives you a bigger font that takes up more space. Matt, which one would you prefer and why?
I'd prefer the one on the right, just because I have bad eyesight, so I can actually see the one on the right.
Very good. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, okay, point taken. Our oldest son is dyslexic, and there are actually fonts that make it easier for him to read as a dyslexic, by the way, just kind of a side note. Well, the research shows that the one on the left is easier to read, is easier on the eyes, and it's Cambria. It is what's called sans font, and I'll show you that in just a second. The one on the right is it's a serif font. The one on the right is a sans serif font. And here's kind of the difference. There are 3 major categories of fonts. There's the serif fonts, the sans serif, and then there's these special effects graphic type fonts. The serif fonts are the oldest, and what they're doing is they're trying to imitate the inscriptions that were chiseled into stone by ancient Rome. The first one was called Times New Roman, right? And these fonts really exude this gravitas. What they do is they have these little curlicues on the letters, if you've never studied this stuff. And science, the research shows that these are easier to read in larger texts. Now, I was like Matt, I like the Arials. Well, I do have bad eyes, but to me, I like this clean, simple, pure look. And so for a long time, I wrote in Arial, and it turns out that Arial is easier to read if you're using short bullets, titles, and things like that. And then down to these special effects. You just don't want to write an academic paper in Comic Sans, right? I just don't even tempt your professor to come down on your head on that. So these are for invitations, funny graphics, cartoons, things like that when you're in kind of a comical mood. Probably inappropriate for most of the stuff that we write. And just a special shout out to Papyrus here. Papyrus exists just to be made fun of. I mean, there are actual websites that are just devoted to making fun of Papyrus. And Saturday Night Live did this wonderful skit on Papyrus. That's the link to it. But if you just Google Saturday Night Live Papyrus skit, it's to die for. It's like 6 minutes, so I can't show it in this workshop, but it is hilarious. They really just skewer Papyrus in a really great way. So my point here, yes, somebody
Can I
had
ask you a question?
You bet, sure.
So if you're doing a presentation, you rather have a sans serif, like Arial
Yes.
calligraphy for a presentation. But if you're going to write a text, a capstone, you look for the serif fonts.
Right. Yeah, that's what I would do. And you'll have a favorite. Cambria is my favorite, but there's these other ones, Bookman, Garamond, Times New Roman. You know, I think Microsoft Word comes with Times New Roman as a default. And then the sans serifs are pretty popular there. Yes, so exactly. Now you can mix fonts. That's a really good point. You can write your text in a serif font, and then for your graphics, for the title for your graphics or the title for your paper, you can go to a sans serif, and that works really well. And there are actual combinations that people like. You can go look that up on the web, but just don't mix more than 2 fonts is kind of the advice that I've seen. Okay, so that's pretty much all I had on this idea of structuring your content. Now, I'm sorry, structuring your paper, manipulating your paper. So let's move into the content. And just to continue with this horrible metaphor, let's move from the structure of the torpedo tube to the payload, the actual torpedo itself, and look at how we can write more effectively and communicate. Okay. So the number one problem with writing at UT, and this is across all year groups and across all disciplines, is failure to answer the professor's prompt. I've done this so many times. I finally came out with a technique so I wouldn't do it anymore. It's really embarrassing to get a feedback from your professor that says, Lynn, this is a wonderful paper, but you didn't answer my question, C-. It's really hard to recover from. So just make sure that we are meeting the reader's expectation by following, excuse me, we're admitting somebody there, Michael. Make sure you meet the reader's expectation, the professor's expectation by actually answering the question. So let me give you an example. This was a prompt for a class. It's a master's class, meets 1 day a week for 3 hours. It was on strategic thinking, but it was a reading class. So the professor would assign a book a week, and then every week the students had to write a 300 to 500 word little blog on what the key arguments were in that reading, and relate that to the significance of larger strategic concepts. And so this is one of the papers that I helped a student with, and it was on Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. And she writes that Michelle Obama gives the readers a glimpse into how she discovered her values and her upbringing in the South Side of Chicago, and her parents were loving and caring and sent her and her brother to Ivy League schools. And then she moves into getting a glimpse into life with Barack Obama, who still leaves his socks laying on the floor, and how he then became a sounding board for her to define her values and to help other people. And then she concludes with her writing provides an optimism that the American dream still exists. So I read through that and I went, well, you know, it's written pretty well. There's some concision things that we could work on, but you missed the prompt, right? You didn't talk at all about what Obama's arguments were, unless her argument was, it's cool to leave your socks on the floor. There's no discussion of the argument here. And you're just regurgitating what everybody else read. So why are you doing this? This adds no value and it doesn't answer the prompt, right? So it's pretty funny because I stay in contact with her, and every time I see her, I say, hey, you've written any book reports lately? And she goes, hey, and she punches me in the arm. So it's kind of a joke. It's okay. But the point is, you can write well, but not write effectively. The second point is that you've got to really stick to the task, and you've got to keep the reader's expectations in mind. Sometimes the reader tells you what they expect to see. Sometimes you get to help the reader shape those expectations, but you've got to keep that reader in mind. And then the third point is, sometimes you write a lot before you finally crack the code. In that very last sentence, she starts scratching at the idea of an argument in this book. She doesn't explore it, but she scratches at the surface. So at this point, what I said was, you just need to throw away everything that came before that last sentence and start at that last sentence and go forward. And I've done this a lot. I mean, I've written 3 to 5 pages and just the thought process, cranking around, getting my thoughts, getting them on paper. I have this aha moment and I just chunk everything and start all over with that thought, because finally I've gotten to the kind of the heart and soul of what I'm supposed to be doing in this paper. Okay, so for your writing to be accessible, you got to meet the reader's expectations, and sometimes you get to shape those expectations, all right? And you can start shaping those expectations with the title of your paper. So if you're writing a letter or a memo for record or an email, that title is really the subject line. So we need to think about those subject lines, those titles, and how those are shaping the expectations of dear reader. And so our titles need to be eye-catching. They need to grab the interest of the reader right off the bat. They need to predict the content. So this is where we start shaping those expectations. We start preparing the reader's mindset for what we're about to lay out for them. It needs to reflect the tone, right? The tone of a research paper, much different than the tone of a graphic novel. And it kind of needs to be digestible. You need to be able to read it and not go, I have no idea what this is talking about. You just made your writing inaccessible right off the bat, okay? So when do you write your title? I do like a lot of people, and I just put it off till the end, right? I write my entire paper, then I go write the title that matches the paper. But in fact, Richard Leahy in his wonderful article here says, you can actually use your title as a tool. You can put your title up first, and as you're starting to write your paper, you're now shaping your paper to fit that title, right? So it helps you think about how you're going to lay out the arguments based on this title that you wrote, and it helps keep you on track. And then as your writing begins to evolve, as it inevitably will, you go back and change your title. So now you've kind of got this record of how your paper is morphing over time, right? And so I tried doing that in a couple of papers, and it really kind of helped me. I'm not sure I would do it all the time, but there is something about putting your paper, your title up in front of you, and as you write, just going back to the title and going, yeah, am I still writing? Okay, did I change? Did I just change my whole paper? So I need to go back and change the title. And does that affect the thesis sentence? So this writing is this ever-evolving, iterative process that we go through. So let's take a couple of looks. Let's take a look at a couple of titles. So Maria, if you would pick one of these 4 titles and just give us an assessment of, is that title eye-catching for you? What content do you think it's predicting? Does it reflect what's the tone do you think is going to be in there? And was that title digestible? Maria, are you with us?
Ah, yes.
There we go. Yes. Okay.
So I need to read a title, right?
Yeah.
Batman: The Dark Knight Returns.
Okay, good. Is it eye-catching? Was that eye-catching for you?
To me, it's eye-catching.
Okay. Why is that eye-catching for you?
It's short, it's clear, and it's attractive somehow.
Okay. I thought you were going to say you're a big Batman fan. That would be a reason.
No, at all. Maybe that's
Okay.
why I say it was eye-catching.
Very good. It's different. It's something you hadn't thought about before. So maybe this is something that just piqued your interest. What about the content? What do you expect to find in there?
Why he is the Knight of the Dark.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's going to be a little fantasy. It's going to be a little fiction. It's not probably not going to be nonfiction, right? And what's the tone? What is this? A dark tone? A light tone? Is it a comedy? Is it a serious academic piece? What's the tone?
No. It's light.
Okay, good. Yeah, and we already talked about it being digestible, right? It's fairly easy to read and sort out. Okay, Susanna, why don't you pick the next one and kind of walk through your assessment as well?
Okay, I guess the first one, transitional commercial surrogacy, microcosm of female inequality.
Okay. Eye-catching?
No.
Okay. All right. Why? What makes it unattractive to you?
It's just very long. It's very verbose.
Okay. All right. What do you think what does it predict for the content? If you were to go ahead and read this, what do you think the content is going to be signaling? What do you think it's going to be about? What do you expect to find in the content?
You mean transnational commercial surrogacy. So I would say it's going to be more of an academic paper.
Okay, good. Yeah. And what about the tone? You said academic, so that kind of covers that, right?
Yeah.
And you talked about it not being very digestible. Okay. Good, thank you. Yeah, so you all are getting the hang of this. Notice that a lot of people in their papers, especially the longer papers, will kind of have two titles: Transnational Commercial Surrogacy, a microcosm of female inequality. And the first part of that will kind of be short and quick. And then the second phrase will be more descriptive. In Defense of Troublemakers, oh man, I've got to read that book because I'm a troublemaker. The Power and Dissent in Life and Business. So this is an academic book, one of the most powerful books I've read in the last 5 years, by the way, but it is really about how powerful dissent is in organizational decision-making. So it's really a cool book. All right, so very good. Okay, now remember, if our reader detects a disconnect between the title and the content, we've just created this barrier. They're going to be thinking more about why did Lynn write it that way than what is Lynn trying to get across, right? If I write a research paper and I title it something very academic and I turn it into a graphic novel and a joke book, boy, that reader's going to be really upset with me and probably not even going to read through the piece, all right? Okay, so we then continue to shape our readers' expectations in our introduction. And I've forgotten who it was now, gave us a wonderful overview of introductions earlier. The introduction has a thesis statement. This is, what is this paper about? And I often start my papers exactly like that. The purpose of this paper is, and then later I make it a little more academic-y, but that's kind of how I start every paper because I want to make it clear in my mind why I'm writing this paper, right? It's the organizational principle or the main claim or argument that you're going to be making throughout this paper. Your introduction also gives you a little background. This adds context and kind of orients the reader, all right? So again, it's the shaping the reader's expectations, shaping his or her mindset. It includes the Greek words exigence and kairos, which are big fancy terms for urgency and timing. So the introduction usually creates some sense of urgency. Why am I writing this paper and why should you read this? And the kairos is, the Greeks used to say that your argument had to be at the right time in the right place, right? It had to be at the right moment. So you need to, your intro, if it's really good, says this is really urgent and we need to do this right now because. And this is a difficult argument to make nowadays with COVID, right? I'm going to go into my boss and I'm going to say, we need to change our processes. And he's going to look at me and go, dude, I'm just trying to keep the business alive. Don't come to me with changes, right? So kairos and exigency are very big components. And then generally the introduction will have a signpost. By the way, I'm going to post these charts. You'll have access to them later, so you don't need to write everything down. A signpost is just a mini outline. I'm again going to set the expectation of my reader by laying out, hey, in these 3 paragraphs, I'm going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And I'll do that really craftily so it's not really obvious, but it sets that mindset that, okay, I expect you to argue this point, this thesis, and I expect it to kind of come in this order. And again, you have to be really careful because if you say I'm going to talk about A, B, and C, and then you talk about C, D, and E, you're just going to confuse the reader and make your writing harder to access. Okay, so let me give you an example of an intro here. I actually wrote this paper for Dr. Mary Rose. It was a quantitative research methodology course. I had a B- going into this paper, by the way, so this really sticks out in my mind. Here's my background. Surveys are an excellent tool for conducting primary research because the responses lend themselves to quantitative analysis. With my research looming soon, Kairos, I must be able to form effective research questions, exigents, that will accurately measure the behaviors I'm interested in. My thesis, this paper explores 8 survey questions I've developed, and I'm going to describe what I'm attempting to measure, why that question is appropriate conceptually, and how each question conforms to the measurement principles that we studied in Mary Rose's class. Oh, by the way, this is exactly what Mary Rose expected me to write. This was her prompt. Develop 8 survey questions. Describe what you're attempting to measure, why these questions are appropriate conceptually, and how they conform to measurement principles, right? So I'm not only setting the expectation for anybody that might read this paper, I'm telling Mary Rose, I'm meeting your expectation. I got a 100 on this paper. It pulled me up to an A. Really cool. When I talked to my classmates at the break about their papers and their grades, most of them had not put in all of those requirements. They had either not talked about what they're trying to measure or why that's appropriate conceptually or how they conform to measurement principles. So just missing parts of the prompt means that you're not meeting your reader's expectations, which is not a good thing, as we've discussed. Okay, good introduction sets the context, prepares the reader's mindset, and gives her a sense of purpose and direction for that paper. Now you have to meet it, right? So the body of your paper. And this is a quote from Steven Pinker. He wrote this really great book. I'd recommend it if you're kind of geeking out on this kind of stuff. It's called The Sense of Style. Good writing takes advantage of the reader's expectations of where to go next. So if you set up these expectations, now we have to meet those expectations. And we're going to do that in the body of our paper. We talked about this. It presents our arguments that support the thesis. Generally, there are paragraphs, and each paragraph has a topic sentence that states a claim that supports that thesis. And then it contains evidence that support the topic sentence. So there are many arguments in each of the paragraphs. And you should always be asking, does your evidence support your claim? And is your evidence contextualized so the reader will understand who or where it comes from? And here's a hint. Your evidence is never evident. You really have to go out of your way to make it clear to your reader, in my experience. Okay? Now, if you're writing a larger paper like a thesis or a dissertation, it's kind of the same thing. It's just on a grander scale. So you may have sections that are separate arguments that support the overall thesis of the thesis paper itself, or the term paper or the research paper or whatever. So let's take a look at this. I'll read it to you and then I'll ask some of you to give me a quick assessment of it. Because of the social stigma surrounding teenage sexual activity, teenagers are unlikely to receive substantive information about contraception. Many states have laws barring the teaching of birth control methods other than abstinence. Some school districts have no sex education curriculum at all. Parents are also unlikely sources of information about sex and contraception. Most expect that their children will abstain from sex until they move out and strictly police their children's sexual behavior, so they do not see the need to open a conversation about it. This dearth of information leaves the teens ill-prepared for sex by allowing myths to propagate and eliminates the possibility of birth control. So Boya, what do you think about this? Is there a topic sentence? Is that topic sentence supported by data or claims in the rest of the paragraph? What's going on here? How do you think this plays out? Boya, if you're talking to us, you're on mute. And she may be taking a break. So let's move to Jennifer. Jennifer, what do you think? Watch your mute button there.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So, okay, tell me again.
Okay, so is there a topic sentence in here somewhere? What do you think the topic sentence is here?
I think the topic sentence is the last sentence.
Okay, all right, good. Anybody else? Vera, what do you think the topic sentence is? Vera. Hello, Vera. Okay, let me just for the sake of time here, and Jennifer, you're close, and I'll explain why in just a second. So there is a claim in this, and the topic sentence is right off the bat. Because of social stigma around teenage sexual activity, there's just not a lot of information, right? That's going to help these children understand their options. All right. And then it's supported, that topic is supported in two ways. We talk about government's activities and we talk about parents' activities. And then finally, there's this summary that kind of very nicely wraps everything up. It's this dearth of information that leaves teenagers ill-prepared for sex. Actually, this is not so much a claim as it is a counterclaim. And so this is just a fine point here. But sometimes when you're arguing, you want to think about what the other person's going to argue, and you want to counter that through a counterclaim. And so this turns out to be kind of the reverse of a claim, but neither here nor there for this purpose. All right. So I think here's how I would have made this a little stronger. First of all, I would have connected the topic sentence to the first data point by putting in one of these connectors, like, for example. So unlikely to receive substantive information about contraceptives. For example, many states have laws. And in addition, parents are also unlikely sources because they expect their children will abstain from sex. And then in the summary, which kind of goes back and ties you back to the topic sentence, I might have added, it would have been nice to have added a little transition sentence that transitions you until the next argument. But a lack of information is only part of the problem. Boom, and you go into your second argument. Okay. Now, highlighted in green is just a reminder for me. This person is spending a little more time talking about parents and the result of their actions, right, as they did in the first, many states and school districts. So in this case, I think the author could have shortened that third paragraph, parents are also unlikely sources, or else beefed up the part about many states and school districts so that they're both in proportion and they both kind of talk in parallel. Here's what states do and the outcome of it. Here's what parents do and the outcome of it. And now they're both kind of parallel and a little more satisfactory. But overall, I thought this was a pretty good paragraph that the student had written. So this is, remember I talked to you about the first year doc student that came in and the one paragraph is longer than the other two paragraphs. Here's the paragraph. Let me read it to you. Rural and urban areas differ in various aspects, whether economic, cultural, social, political, or religious. Universities inserted in diverse environments influence and are directly influenced by these aspects. School managers and those who make education policy in the United States argue that small schools and districts are too costly. Dunn found that rural people were proud of their schools and typically described a feeling of family, individual attention, and community commitment of resources and people. Surveys in rural areas reflected a 75% level of satisfaction with existing schools. However, there's a greater concentration of universities in large urban centers where proximity to labor markets are greater and thus greater number of job opportunities are offered. Okay, so I read that and I go, okay, you're not happy with this paragraph. I'm not happy with the paragraph. And now the question is, what is it about this paragraph that makes us unhappy? What's going on in this paragraph that leaves us dissatisfied or just feeling like, I don't know what you're doing here? Pablo, any thoughts?
Well, the author here, most of his statements are based on some kind of paper or surveys that I don't think, it could be move to a reference section, and you have, you know, you can put the concept there and just put a number and have a reference section. That's how medical papers are. They don't go over the, like here you have McCracken and vaccine in 1981.
Right.
I think, you know, that I understand what he's trying to do, but I think it cuts the flow of the read.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, what do you think in reading over this?
Yeah, there's this contrast between rural and urban areas that you start out with, but then you go to these school settings that don't directly tie into the urban and rural divide, so you're left missing it and you have to fill it in yourself. And at the
Yeah.
very end, you know, you try to say that universities are urban, but you still don't have that, you know, contrast with the rural schools. It's missing all these comparison and contrast.
Yeah. And you're saying that universities are in these urban centers, but earlier you said that universities are in diverse environments. So I'm kind of confused there. Jay, what do you think? One more opinion and we'll move on.
Yeah, you know, those are all points kind of resonate with me, and also the first sentence doesn't really tell you. I think the intent of the paragraphs talk about the universities and the comparison between the rural or urban environments, but the first sentence is more pointed around just talking about the difference between rural and urban environments and not in
Yeah.
relation to the universities. So
Yeah, exactly. And I had a real hard time picking out the topic, right? I don't know what the topic sentence is, and therefore I don't know what's supporting what. And it's okay, by the way, in your paragraphs, you can start out with a little introduction. That's okay, but you need to get your topic sentence near the front very quickly. And back to Jennifer's comment earlier, I forgot about this. If you really think your topic sentence is at the end, then you need to rearrange that paragraph. And I mean, I'm sorry, I kind of forgot about that, but I often find that students lay out this introduction in their argument and then they give a topic sentence, and you need to move that topic sentence back up so that you're defending that topic. It's at the top of the mind for the reader. Yeah, great points, everybody. This paragraph's really lacking two very important things. The first is coherence. So coherence, think lasers. Lasers, we get all these photons and we get them real dense and we point them in the right direction. I mean, this very powerful light now that can cut through metal, right? So your paragraphs have to have coherence. They have to take the reader in a direction, and that direction ought to be in support of the thesis of the overall paper, right? So there doesn't appear to be a topic sentence or a claim. And the paragraph doesn't seem to be taking us in any particular direction. As a matter of fact, if you look at it, school managers and those who make educational policy in the United States argue that small schools and districts are too costly. That's not tied to any concept in here whatsoever, right? There's no other sentence that relates to. Dunn found this and McCracken found that, and those two sentences are related, but then they're not related to anything that went before or after, right? And so we say that this paper lacks cohesion. So think stickiness, right? The sentences don't seem to be connected. They don't have these connectors, you know? Also, in addition to, on the other hand, there's nothing that connects them together. And we just can't understand how the cost of small schools relates to satisfaction in schools or the labor markets near universities. So it's incoherent and it's just not cohesive. And that's why the student realized that and told me that this paragraph needed work. She knew that. She just didn't know why, and we worked together to fix it. So one of the points there is that you know when the writing needs help, needs work. You may not know why in all the grammatical terms, but that's okay. You don't need to. You just need to work on it and revise it until it gets to the point where it does make sense to you and makes sense, hopefully, to your reader. Okay? So if we don't lead our reader along the path that we promised, we make it difficult for him to access our concepts. We just confuse them, and then they're wondering, Lynn, why did you write that paragraph? I don't understand how that ties into anything else. Okay, conclusion, which is really cool because we've got 7 minutes left. I love this. And a plug to the Writing Center. If you go to the Writing Center, we have all sorts of papers about writing introductions and conclusions and writing an APA and writing an MLA, just hundreds of papers that can help you out with almost any writing that you're doing. And this came out of the Writing Center on how to write conclusions, which I am terrible at. So it says the conclusion is your gift to your reader. I love that. It brings the paper full circle. It creates this sense of conclusion or closure. So at the end of it, your reader goes, that met my expectations. I'm so glad I read this paper. That makes a lot of sense. And they give me concepts that I can think about. And they're not worried about why, Lynn, did you write this terrible paragraph? But here's where I fail. I just simply summarize. As a matter of fact, I take my introduction, I turn it upside down. You know, my conclusion says, I talked about these three things, and here's the thesis of my paper. I'm terribly unimaginative. But you can play this game called the so what game. So you go, why did you write this paper? For X. Well, so what? So who cares? Why did you do that? And here's an example. So basically, my paper just says that education was important to Douglas. So what? Well, it was important to Douglas because it was a key to him to feeling like he was a free and equal citizen. Who cares? Well, that's important because plantation owners tried to keep slaves from being educated so they could maintain control over those slaves. And when Douglas obtained an education, he personally undermined that control. Boom. That's a great conclusion, right? It took all of those arguments and it didn't repeat them. It just pulled them to a higher level. And just really great. Here's a couple of other examples. As you can see, the evidence suggests that cats like to hunt. Well, based on data, cats look for opportunities to hunt for sport, proving that they're natural predators. Okay, just a better way to wrap everything up and conclude. So speaking of conclusions, I'm going to give another terrible metaphor. I apologize. But for me, writing is more like a bowl of spaghetti than it is a little tea sandwich. You know, the tea sandwich you have at high noon, and it's a little perfectly rectangular piece of bread with the crust cut off. It's got a little bit of filler in between, and it takes like 1,000 of them to fill you up, right? You can just gobble these things all day long and never get full. But writing is more like a bowl of spaghetti. You have all these ideas that are all connected to each other. They all get tangled up. And when you start pulling on one noodle, other noodles start moving around. And this is what writing is. And this is why revision is so important. Because as you begin to put your ideas on paper, your ideas begin to morph and change. And it's often the case that you hit on something in the 5th paragraph that makes you go all the way back to the beginning and start changing. And I've rewritten thesis statements. I mean, I have completely changed papers. And my caution is, in your conclusion, if you bring this up to an aha moment, you may then need to go start rewriting your paper. You may have just evolved your paper into something completely different on a completely different level. And then, of course, you have to check and make sure that that's what your professor expects you to write about so you don't get in trouble. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here.